My name is Justin Farris, VP of Product at GitLab, and I'm here to talk today a little bit about AI product development processes and how things have changed so dramatically since this AI revolution hit us a couple years back. So a little bit on me. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. I'm currently in a cave, what it looks like. That's my garage, but it's sunny outside in Seattle, which is great. But I've spent some time at GitLab, and then prior to that, I spent some time at Zillow. So I've worked across marketplaces and B2B SaaS and kind of all over in between. So let's talk a little bit about today in this session. First and foremost, we're going to spend about 25 minutes. I'm going to walk you through some observations I've had building AI products over the past couple of years. And then we're going to do some prompting, this time with responses from a human, me. And we'll do some Q&A. So it's actually kind of equal. I'm really excited about this because I want to hear your questions and have a really open conversation around this topic. So how to ask questions. There's a Q&A button on your screen. Go ahead and use that. The chat's disabled, and I think the raise hand function is disabled as well. But please drop your questions in there. And then the folks will help moderate these questions when it's time. And then general chatter, networking conversation. There's a Discord. I'm going to join it after we hang up. And I'd love to continue the conversation there. And I think the link should be in the Zoom chat. Okay, without further ado, AI powered products. So I recently took an Uber from SFO into the city in San Francisco, and I'm pretty sure every billboard along the way had AI powered, not trademarked, on every single product. So everything from back in the day, same advertising, same products that were advertised, but now they're all AI powered. So what I want to spend time today is talking about the traditional process and what we've been used to for many, many years in tech and how that's transformed as you build products with AI. When you think about traditional product development, it's actually kind of inherently simple, or at least we're sort of standing on top of giants who have built a lot of processes and frameworks for us over the years. We spent decades perfecting this craft. We have great tools at our disposal and a bunch of industry experts and things like Reforge that can help us get from 0 to 1 really, really quickly, much better than it ever was 10 or 15 years ago. But things have changed dramatically because of AI, and it requires an evolved approach. Discovery is more important than ever. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail. And while development can be quick, you end up spending a lot more cycles, in my experience, refining and improving what you've built in market versus doing something in stealth and iterating before you've launched something. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail too. So the way to work through this, I want to talk about three sort of main themes I've seen, and what's happened traditionally and what is evolving because of AI. And then we'll kind of break each one down with a little bit more detail. So first is discovery. I just mentioned this. A lot of builders have built products off of a large corpus of foundational knowledge. I think about a lot of the PMs that we've hired at GitLab, and many of them are deep, deep domain experts in the area that they're responsible for in the product, which is super cool for us because that enables us to move really quickly. And we kind of shortcut a lot of the validation that you might usually do. You kind of get 90% of the way there. And there's a bunch of tools that help you close that gap where you don't have it. With AI, talking to users, I know this might sound cliche, but it's more important than it ever has been before. It requires new types of questions and new ways to validate your assumptions because these systems are inherently not deterministic. And so you have to change your approach, and we'll get into that in a minute. The next one is around how you build stuff. It's unlikely in the past that you would need a really robust prototype to validate an idea. Usually you can get by with a pretty good PRD, some Figma mockups, a solid plan and an Epic or something like that, and you're off to the races. But with AI, it often requires that you see and feel the product and how you might interact with it to validate some of those early assumptions. And so prototyping becomes incredibly important. And then finally, something I've observed is that MVP, the definition of it, has sort of evolved over the years. MVP is really now like a very mature product in market. Apps are built in stealth and then they launch like, oh my gosh, that thing is amazing. And that was because we have all these great tools. But with AI, you really need to embrace iteration and iterate while the product is actually live in market and available to your users. And we'll talk about ways to navigate that because that can be incredibly risky. Okay, so let's deep dive into discovery first. The first insight here is around who you talk to. What kind of humans should you interact with? to gain that insight and to actually validate some of your assumptions. In my experience, and I'll give you an example, humans with deep expertise typically unlock excellent insights in research and give you the seeds for really good prompt engineering. The common example or simple example here with GitLab is we have a code suggestions product. It's a feature that enables developers to quickly type some code and use generative AI suggestions to complete their work. GitLab is a Ruby application. And so naturally, our Ruby devs are validating the usefulness and quality of our code suggestions product day in and day out, but we may not have the deep expertise in, say, Python, Go, or some other language. And so talking to deep experts will give you those insights that you can then feed back into your product development process, like I said, to improve prompts or just validate some early assumptions. The next one, and this one I think is really powerful, and I'm going to show you an example of this, but observe manual workflows. When you think about these generative AI tools, a lot of what we've been doing over the past couple of years is follow the leader. You see what ChatGPT does, you see what OpenAI announces, and you kind of pick up on an insight and kind of try something out. But one of the greatest insights you can get is if you figure out what your users are struggling with in the real world, do some ride-alongs, look into those manual workflows, things where there's a lot of toil and a lot of heartache in working through a problem, and then figure out how AI can be layered on top of that to improve an already existing workflow. So let's look at an example of that. Root cause analysis is a feature inside of GitLab. And for those of you unfamiliar, when you have a CI pipeline, so you've written a bunch of code, you've pushed that code and you want to build it. And you're going to have a bunch of tests and validation that run against that code. And when something fails, and you can see this in the scroll here, there are dozens, sometimes hundreds of jobs that run. And when one fails, figuring out what's wrong is incredibly painful. And you have to scroll through hundreds or thousands of log lines. This feature, root cause analysis, does all of that work for you. It takes that very toil-driven manual process, finds the right suggestion, and then offers a way for you to fix that broken pipeline without a ton of effort. Super cool. So that insight came from us just spending time watching developers build apps and how much time they're stuck captively waiting or trying to figure out the problem with their pipeline. The last one here is a what if workflow analysis, and I'll dig into this in a second. But you have to ask yourself, how might a workflow change with the introduction of AI? And you've seen this in products you've used. Is it a chatbot that sits on the side? Is it fully replace it, or does it augment it in some way? And so let's look at these examples. On replace, it's doing the work for you. So in this example, this is another GitLab feature that summarizes a bunch of changes in a merge request. So you make a bunch of code changes and you don't want to have to write, English or prose to describe the change you just made. It is doing the job for you. Super cool. Is it augmentation? So it's helping you do some of the work for you, but you're still doing some copying and pasting. In root cause analysis, the feature I just showed you, it's a similar example where it'll show you what's wrong, but it'll give you the example to fix it, but you still need to actually go and make the change to the code. So it's not going to change code for you. And then sidecar is the chatbot example. So you might have something that sits alongside of the work you're doing where you can ask it questions, you can copy and paste things back and forth. So it's a new tool. It's not a replacement or an augmentation to an existing tool. It's a net new tool that you use alongside of the work you're already doing. So you kind of have to ask yourself, which one of these is it? Because sometimes when you're trying to do multiple at the same time, it can get really confusing and the user experience can suffer because of it. All right, let's move on to prototyping. I mentioned Figma earlier. I think Figma is a brilliant example of really great prototypes. And back in the day, before this AI revolution, it was usually good enough. You could do something like this that you see in the slide, and you could stitch together a minimal UI to kind of convey something and convey an idea or get some early feedback from users. Doesn't let you validate AI features. It doesn't let you actually feel or experience what it's like to interact with an LLM with the context and data you're using as you're building a product. So how do you evolve this? First and foremost, you need to have a low level of shame. This is super important. You're going to show a POC to a user, to a customer, and it's going to be embarrassing. It's probably going to fail. It might hallucinate. You have to be okay with that. You have to set expectations up front. You have to help the user navigate through the POC, but you have to be okay that it might be less polished. The next is it's really engineering driven. Engineers can stand these things up relatively quickly. And it gives developers space to evaluate models, prompt engineering techniques, or experiment with RAG to improve context. And so it might be a product development flow where instead of spending a bunch of time up front refining your PRD, refining UX mockups and prototypes, you give engineering enough to get going, and then you let them iterate and experiment. And then finally show it off. All POCs, like I said, it might be embarrassing, and they're probably not worthy of shipping to users in a production context, but you can't be afraid to show it off. That early feedback is really important to help guide you if you're off track. So, a little bit of humility, I'm going to show you a very early prototype. So this is something we're working on at GitLab called Dual Workflow. I won't explain in too much detail what it is, but our insight here is that, hey, there's a lot of processes developers have to walk through to get going on a new project, like setting up a new project, initializing a repo, configuring their CI YAML, all these various bits. It's really painful. So wouldn't it be nice if we can automate that with the power of AI for that user? This is not a prototype that we will plan to ship to customers, but it's a very early working example of this happening, or we can start to show it to people and get feedback. So if you have feedback, please send it to me. But you want to have get that out in front of as many people as possible so you can get that early feedback. Okay, and then finally, outputs are deterministic, which means the user inputs or user experience, excuse me, is indeterministic. I'm sorry. So things like constitutional AI grounding, you can sort of guide your experience into something that has a lot of guardrails and that prevents a lot of bad outcomes. But at the end of the day, these systems, users will find a way to work around them. And so if you are able to start by experimenting with interaction, so using those prototypes to find the edge cases, you can quickly get that feedback early. So have your users or the people that are playing with prototypes ask it random questions, trigger it from strange workflows. For example, when we first introduced GitLab Duo Chat, we were asking a lot of strange questions to see what would come out the other end. Some were incredibly silly, but some guided us, into refining the context we put into the prompts. And then finally, context is key. It might make sense, or you might think it makes sense to put a ton of context into prompts. These large language models support millions of tokens now, but sometimes that actually just will slow down your response overall, or it will muddy the interaction. Experiment with small bite-sized chunks of context, to see what actually matters. And experiment with both foundational and personal context. What I mean there is foundational context might be, hey, I have this great, if I'm building like a coding assistant, I have this great library that's commonly used to do this thing. I'm going to use that as context for this particular type of thing, versus I know what this user is using or what files this user has open on their machine. I'm going to pass that as context into the model. Experiment with both of them. There's probably a mix that makes the most sense, and it's not necessarily always one or the other. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about data. Oftentimes in the past, we would use mock data. So when I remember it was at Zillow, we would have like 123 Main Street, and it was like the perfect home, and that was how we would test houses when we would be building new features and things like that. With AI, that becomes inherently much more challenging because you need a large corpus, a breadth of data to get a great experience. So it's a good starting place, and don't get me wrong, you should start there. It's good to just get something going, pass some prompts, and you can curate that mock data to predictable outcomes so you can validate some of those early builds. But you need to move on quickly to real world dog fooding examples. So give it to internal users and have your internal users or closest, trusted customers, if that's the case, use this product first, use the POC first. And that'll give you a treasure trove of data of examples to test in your early prototypes. But if you've ever tried dog food before, it gets kind of stale quickly and it's not very tasty. And so you're going to have to move on from it at some point. And I wouldn't rely on it too long. What'll likely happen, and we've seen this, is users will find the workarounds or the ways that it works and the ways that it doesn't. And so they'll stop using it for the ways that it doesn't work, and it'll go back to using other tools or their old ways, and you won't get that feedback flowing back in. And so finally, you need to get to real users to evaluate the experience. They're going to give you the best feedback, and you need to figure out how to get in the hands of those users as soon as possible. The way we've approached this problem is by launching products in experimental state. And this might seem risky depending on the product, but at the end of the day, the best approach is to get it in the hands of those users and then set the expectations early. So if you call it an experimental feature, the users will understand, hey, this is something that might not be ready for prime time, but I'm willing to use it and I'm willing to give feedback. And then don't shy away from introducing opportunities to share that feedback, whether that's, little comment boxes or thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever makes the most sense to give you that feedback. Okay, so now let's talk about iteration. Once you ship, you're just getting started. And this is something we've all lived very firsthand over the past couple of years building products. These models are evolving in incredibly rapid pace. Claude 3.5 Sonnet launched last week, and it seems really great. I'm sure another model from a different AI provider will launch next week, and you have to keep iterating, you have to keep learning. And so unlike the past, where we could probably iterate in stealth mode as we refine a product and then you have this great launch, you're probably going to launch with a product that you're not as proud of compared to where you can develop it towards over the course of several months. So why iteration? Let's start there. Why is this important? Feedback and private betas become useless pretty quickly. Private betas are inherently limited, and those users are going to be guided around guardrails based on their expectations. And that's usually good at the very beginning. So I'm not saying don't do that. But it will run out of its value really, really quickly. And those users are kind of expected to be a demo experience. And so in our case, when, users would evaluate GitLab Duo AI capabilities, they would do so in an evaluative point of view. And so they would have people test something and send it to their users and say, if it's an admin, send it to their users and say, hey, go try this out and tell me what you think, versus, hey, go deploy this into your production workflow. Go deploy this into something that you plan to use day in and day out. And then secondarily, there are infinite edge cases to what you think is the happy path. In traditional product development, you could probably define the happy path really clearly and then define what your 4 or 5 common edge cases are and then solve for that. And you've probably covered 95% of the ways your users are going to use the product. That's not the case anymore. And in many ways, the edge cases kind of are the happy path. And so you have to solve around that. And the best way is to iterate. So let's talk about strategies of how to get there. We talked about this a moment ago. Ship early while in experimental state. As an example, we shipped our first experiments last January for our AI capabilities at GitLab, and some of those products are still in beta. And so we are constantly refining and iterating on those. And you're not going to be alone if you're doing that. Everyone from startups to big tech, I think Google, most of their products are still in beta. And so their experiments, their previews, their beta, call it what you need to. And that helps you set those early expectations with customers that this is something that will still change, that you're iterating on it and that you're constantly improving it, but allows you to get something into market very quickly without having to wait until something is polished. This is sort of back to the shipping is better than waiting theory. Next is around finding existing customers who will co-develop and partner with you. Your strongest advocates and the folks that will be the most critical of your AI features are the ones that love your product already. If you're an existing app, they're already a user and they want to see how AI will improve this product and make their lives, their experiences, their use of it better. And they're going to want to co-develop. They're going to want to give you feedback. They're going to want to get into the weeds with you and say, hey, have you tried this? What about this? They'll ask you questions about models that come out. They'll be really deeply engaged. And so you want to let them in the kitchen to contribute. You want to give them access to the product team, give them access to the designers, give them access to your engineers to get that feedback flowing very quickly and unencumbered back to you. And then setting expectations that refinement is going to take a while. I mentioned a moment ago, we have features that are still in beta that we launched as an experiment over a year ago. Reaching GA may take an order of magnitude longer than the MVP and tremendously longer than what you're used to from traditional product development. And that's okay. Setting those expectations again to refine the product in a way that makes sense is better than the alternative, which is going to market really quickly with something, claiming it's GA, and then sort of dealing with the blowback in market when the product doesn't work well. And so you really have to set those expectations early. Let's touch on edge cases briefly. So, like I said, there are many edge cases you have to solve for. Anyone that's interacted with ChatGPT realizes that you can ask it 100 different questions. And so these LLMs can take you any which direction you might want. And the ways that you hope your users don't use the tool, they will find a way to use it. And so a couple principles here. First and foremost, fail gracefully. Um, you know, chatbots commonly fail when they don't want to answer questions, and the way someone will build this is they just say, I can't answer that, and they'll sort of block it. You'll see this from a sort of content restriction perspective. I think of the early days of Siri, where Siri would sort of kick you off to the web. I think it still does that in a lot of cases. It would kick you off to the web if it couldn't answer a question. I think that's a good example of trying to fail gracefully, but it got stale quickly. But think through ways that you can redirect a user to a decent outcome if they're wandering into a territory that you don't want to support yet through deeper prompting and so on. So guide them to documentation, guide them to a support channel, guide them to somewhere else that might give them a better answer versus just sort of failing out of the flow. Next, around building a document of edge cases and starting to group and stack rank. This might sound very obvious, but this is something we've done internally where you go start to write down, okay, what are the different ways in which this is failing? What are the different edge cases you might have? You can use something as simple as a Google Sheet. I've seen robust versions of this that show up in Notion and so on, but you can build these out, and it allows you to give visibility to your stakeholders to influence prioritization and then kind of suss out common themes. I think a good way to use this too is do like a post-it note exercise if you get together in person with your team, and have them kind of put post-its on the board to organize things and then focus the team on what kind of edge cases you want to go solve for. And then finally, iterate on the foundation. I think one of the best decisions we made was creating a model agnostic infrastructure so we can swap out models really quickly when a new model comes out or we want to try a model for a different use case. The prompt library is abstracted as well. And so this AI world, the fundamental technology we're built on top of right now, it's not stable. Traditional product development, all of that, the web technology, your mobile app technology, all of those pieces are very stable for the most part. AI is not. And so you need to make sure you have the flexibility in being able to change the foundation really quickly. So I wanted to show this example because this is sort of to prove the point of, hey, we want to spend some time iterating. So Code Suggestions, GitLab's, one of GitLab's largest AI products, we launched in beta in May of 2013. And since then, it reached GA, excuse me, in December of 2023. We've had 7 major releases in that time, 328 deployments, and dozens of customer feedback sessions over many days, and we're still iterating on it. And so this is something that will take you a while, but be patient and work through it, and keep iterating. Okay, so key takeaways. AI has changed everything, and it requires an evolved approach. So we talked about discovery. Talking to users is really the most important thing you can ever do. Don't hide behind surveys and anecdotal feedback and general, purely quantitative data. Actually get out and talk to users and find new ways to validate your assumptions. Build prototypes and build them early. Give engineering enough to go on, and then have them see what they can do. And then you'll have something you can see and play with and share with 4,000 of your favorite friends. And then finally, iteration. It's one of GitLab's core values, but move away from MVPs being a perfect and complete product, and actually spend time with the product live and building it and working together with your users to improve it. So, oh, there you go. I skipped this slide, or I talked too fast through the slide. So that's what I just said. All right. I know that was a lot really quickly. So with that, we'll jump into Q&A.
Absolutely. So we're ranking them in terms of upvotes. So the first one is from Antonina. How do you manage to iterate if your product is a highly regulated one or if it's high risk, like in healthcare?
Oh gosh, this is a great question. And very true to GitLab. GitLab, some of our biggest customers are public sector customers, and they're in highly regulated environments. You know, we still try and ship quickly and regularly to those customers, and give them access to features and capabilities as soon as they hit our SaaS, GitLab.com product. And so I definitely recommend trying to improve that. We've spent a lot of cycles over the past couple of years, just making it easier for customers to upgrade when they're in a heavily regulated environment. Sometimes that involves helping them get through their audit processes more efficiently, giving them coaching and support on upgrading versions and all that good stuff. So I definitely recommend doing that as a foundational piece. What I have noticed though is this AI demand has really had those industries rethink their processes and be more motivated to move quickly to adopt these technologies. But what you have to make sure you do is get the foundation correct in the thing you ship. So if it's something where they're running the version of your application on premises or in an environment that they control and not a SaaS product, you need to give them the foundational bits to make AI work without requiring them to make breaking changes down the road. And so that's an important thing. That might be something different than we just talked about. Be a little bit more thoughtful in that first actual iteration, that first MVP, that you get the core infrastructure right, so that the subsequent changes you might make to tweaks to prompt engineering, whatever you're doing, are a little bit easier to consume than fundamentally changing your underlying architecture.
Awesome. The next one is from Harsha. How do you differentiate between AI powered versus AI native products?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, my belief is that AI powered is both a real term and a really good marketing spin. Because I've seen a lot of things that are claiming that they're AI powered, but might not actually be. But the way I differentiate it is, um, you know, did your product exist before large language models and transformer models and generative AI? If so, then you adding AI to that is you improving that product writ large. I don't think in 5 years we're going to be calling it AI powered products. I think we're just going to be calling it a product, and AI will be. Everyone should have AI features where it makes sense in their products. An AI native product is a product that couldn't have existed without large language models, without AI as we know it today. And so that's personally how I would differentiate them as you kind of think through what you're building.
Great. The next question is, what's your exit criteria for leaving beta?
Good question. So for us personally at GitLab, it's a couple of things. One, it works on all deployment targets, meaning so we have GitLab you can run on GitLab.com, which is our SaaS multi-tenant environment. We have GitLab Dedicated, which is a single tenant SaaS environment, and then self-managed, which is just you download the bits and you run GitLab yourself. So GA means it works in all of those environments and all deployment types. And then it meets a certain quality bar that we've defined for the product. And that's variable. That could be a whole talk in and of itself, and I'd love to maybe continue that conversation in the Discord. But you have to kind of make a lot of different determinations on what matters, because for one feature, the quality bar might be here, and that's perfectly fine, and you're happy calling it GA. For another feature, it has to get it right. Whoever asked the question about regulated industries, you might have a much higher bar on GA than someone who's building image generators or whatever for a social app, right? And so you kind of have to be intentional about determining that bar based on the feature. But for us, it really is, can all customers access it? Does it meet our quality standards? Is it resilient and reliable? Similar to any web application, are we comfortable with uptime, latencies, and all that good stuff?
Amazing. All right. So the next question is, how do you evaluate your features to know if they're working well? And then how quickly do you iterate on these AI features while still ensuring that they're high quality and reliable? Do you have specific practices or guidelines that help you strike that balance?
Cool. We'll take the first one first. High level, two ways. First and foremost, you can actually typically build, especially for the products that we're building, some deterministic measures in evaluation criteria. So we have actually a model evaluation team as an example that spends a lot of time evaluating new model versions against our use cases, against our prompts. And so there's a lot of systems and apparatus that you can build that gives you evaluative scores. There are others just in the model level that publish these kinds of things on places like Hugging Face and GitHub and whatnot. And so some of that you can do with your own products based, what prompts you're passing to these models. And so you can validate outputs based on that. But at the other end, you need to actually have the indeterministic, the human evaluation. And so we run continuous evaluations. We're fortunate enough that we can dog food most of what we've built, and it's useful day in and day out in every single GitLab team member's, workloads. And so we just have easy ways to provide feedback and validate that. And then the UX research approach has dramatically changed here because you can actually walk into a UX research session with a real product and say, hey, go ask it these questions, observe the user's responses and reactions, and then score that through a rubric you might design. So I kind of look at it that way too. And then the second part of the question, Ben?
Yeah. How do you manage to iterate quickly on AI features while still ensuring they're high quality and reliable? And what are some of the specific practices and guidelines that help you strike that balance?
You can still use A/B tests and feature flags like you have in the past. I think that's a really good way to do it. Um, there are certain customers and types of customers that may be comfortable with bleeding edge. Hey, you want to experiment with Claude 3.5? You're not so sure yet. Probably not something we want to ship to every customer at GitLab yet, but we can dial it up to certain percentages of traffic. You can make that determination internally without exposing that to your users. Or we do things at GitLab like our early access program, where you can sign up and get access to early prototypes, things that we might not roll out broadly to everyone. And then you can evaluate those and give feedback. And so you have to kind of think through the impact of the iteration you're making. Is this something that could fundamentally ruin the experience for everyone that's already using it? In which case, maybe don't roll that out everywhere and roll it out in a smaller capacity. Or if it's a relatively safe change, then, maybe still roll it out incrementally with, canary deployments or sort of typical deployment methodologies, but you can roll it out in a faster pace.
Great. And so for the next question, can you talk a little bit about like the actual automated tooling you use to ensure that iterations are improving? You talked a little bit about the observability and user groups, but what sort of stuff do you have on the back end to see whether or not the tools you're releasing are effective?
Yeah, I don't have a name for it. I don't, or if there is, I don't recall it off the top of my head. But our quality engineering team built this test suite taking some standard methodologies around evaluating coding examples. And these are published on Hugging Face and some other places. And then wrapped them with our own prompt library, hundreds of thousands of prompts, and running a new model, for example, through that apparatus, gives us a score relative to baseline. And so we know baseline because that's what's in production. And so we know what those scores are, and then we can run a new model against that. And there's if you search, there's, depending on your product and your use case, there are a lot of evaluative frameworks out there that can kind of give you that baseline evaluation. And so that's sort of the deterministic, like operational way you can do it. But what I mentioned a second ago is that it's not a replacement for a human using the product. Because in our case, a developer opening, VS Code, typing a change and touching the product, pressing buttons, like going through workflow, is very different than sort of a predetermined. It's like kind of like a unit test versus an integration test versus let's try it out in the product before we hit ship, right? It's sort of, you kind of have to do all three of those layers in order to sort of get a strong enough signal to be comfortable with the change.
Great. I'm going to jump to a related question, then we'll switch topics for a bit. What are some of the metrics that you're looking for? Obviously, retention rates are always important with products and can be difficult with AI products, but what other metrics and KPIs are you using?
Yeah, so I'll give you some generic answers, and then I'll give you an example specific to GitLab. So generically, you can look at things like acceptance rate. So if someone uses the output of the thing, and depending on the product, that can vary widely, right? But if it's simple as you're providing a thing that gives the user, I don't know, a summarization of some prose, some text that they can use in some other thing they're generating, right? And maybe you're generating an email or something like that, and it's taking context from the existing emails they got and making up a product on the fly. But you can use that framework in that context to address it. And sorry, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I cover.
It was just basically what metrics are you using to evaluate success other than like traditional
So
retention.
So yeah, before I get into the GitLab specific example, another couple of metrics that are sort of fundamental are things like latency. This will help you in the right model selection. And so, larger model, this is kind of natural, but larger models are slower inherently than smaller models, although that's changing rapidly. And or just context size, right? It really affects that. And so measuring your latencies across the board. One thing we're observing, if you have customers that are global, is that not everyone's experience is the same from a latency perspective. And this AI infrastructure, although NVIDIA seems to be doing really well, is not rolled out globally in a uniform way. And so if you're in the US, I'm in Seattle, all the AI stuff is super fast. But if you're in another country where maybe that hardware isn't landed yet, it's actually not, the edge compute is not there for you to get the same level of experience as someone that is using it, say, in the US. So those are kind of the fundamental metrics I would look at from like acceptance rate, latencies, and overall kind of quality in that perspective. One thing that's unique to GitLab, and I would encourage you to see if there's in your product, if there's something else that can measure, think about your North Star metrics if you're sort of putting on your growth hat, like retention, like retained usage, things like that. For us, it's all about developer efficiency. And so we have a system inherent into GitLab that we call value stream analytics. It's an industry standard thing. It's using things like DORA metrics and cycle time. And the thing that matters the most for a customer is, hey, I spent some money on this AI stuff. Is it improving the efficiency of my development teams? Well, we're already giving the customer the ability to measure the efficiency of their development teams. Let's give them a filter or a way to toggle on, hey, what is AI doing for the teams that are leveraging GitLab Duo's AI capabilities? How is that improving their efficiency? And what's the delta between them and someone that's not? Or a before and after analysis, right? And so I would encourage you to think through, what is that sort of North Star metric for your product? What actually provides the value to the customer, like a true value metric, and then see if you can understand how AI impacts that value metric. And that might be as simple for you as just general net revenue retention, or retained usage, or now over wow or something like that, right? To understand that perspective.
Yeah, so one issue I think that a lot of people face when they're dealing with metrics is this idea of the tire kickers versus the passionate customers. And I think that we got this one question around like, how do you sort of separate out the tire kickers or identify the tire kickers who are going to just try the AI product and leave, and make sure you're really solving for the customers who are here to actually like use the use case and get real value out of it? Um, is that partially why you lean towards qualitative over quantitative in testing these products, or how do you think about parsing out those two groups in your data sets?
So yes, what you just said is true. I think the more you can hand select who you speak with, the better you're filtering your feedback to the people that matter and that will give you money for the product. I think that's another one. We're monetizing our AI capabilities now, and so the people you talk to, you can quickly filter if they have a subscription or not. And those folks you can solicit feedback from directly, or just look at their usage metrics and usage patterns and compare those to users that are, say, using a product or a feature that's available for free or trial. I'd say trial is another great example of this. It's a different cohort, and that trial user likely has an intent to buy, or an intent to explore at least, versus someone who's just kicking the tires on an absolutely freely available product. But I do think that the discovery piece, the human conversation, really helps you understand what's real. I think a good lesson, a rule of thumb is like, if the data is not backing up your anecdotes, the data is probably wrong, and you should go dig in more closely. And so really spending time to understand that human feedback, if you have it, a UX research team is really powerful here. If you don't have it, there's a lot of great resources to learn how to do it online. But even just getting on a call with the user, getting on a Zoom, or going and sitting next to them really matters.
Great. I'm going to take us into a totally different topic area, which is really around vendors, tools, et cetera. There's
Yeah.
a number of questions here around like, what are the best sets of tools? How do you avoid lock-in with a specific model vendor? And how do you sort of just keep up with like the pace of this, expanding so quickly?
Oh my gosh, I feel like it's half of what I talk about every week at work is like what this vendor is doing or not. Our approach and my recommendation would be to really have a model agnostic strategy here. I'm a fan of the tools that are being built in the hyperscalers with Google Vertex and AWS Bedrock that gives you access to models. There are other systems and platforms that do this too. I'm just picking the two largest hyperscalers or two of the largest hyperscalers as an example. But they allow you to choose most models that hit production. I think both of them probably have the new Claude model now. And then they have a lot of robust tools around deploying those models, validating those models, experimenting with them, fine tuning if that's something you need to do, and so on. There is a risk there that you have a little bit of platform lock-in when you choose the sort of cloud native AI framework from one of those hyperscalers, whether it's say it's Vertex or Bedrock. But we've spent a significant amount of time trying to abstract. We have not to get too deep, but we have something called Model Gateway Service that sits between a GitLab, a client and end user's device or their web IDE or a VS Code, and the actual models themselves served likely through one of the hyperscalers. And so that system can be deployed in any place that we need to. And we spend a lot of time ensuring that that is really flexible. And so I'd spend some cycles there iterating on that to make sure that you have that flexibility when you need to. Sometimes though, you need to just take it from the source directly. Not all these models are getting deployed, although maybe the hyperscaler will claim that that model is deployed in the region you need it in. That might not necessarily be true, and you might be able to get it from a different place. This is some of the pain we deal with. And so maybe calling Anthropic directly actually gives you access to a more performant version of Claude than getting it through one of the hyperscalers. And so you kind of have to be comfortable being flexible in that way.
Cool. And how about the tools for prototyping? What do you use in that space?
Yeah, I would say there's nothing like commercially off the shelf that we've used. Now that might just be my lack of exposure to it, to be honest. So there may be something great out there that I'm unaware of, and I'd love to hear more about it. But for us, it's building some tooling ourselves to quickly stand up experiences. The one I showed off is leveraging our VS Code plugin framework that we've built, and that's using a language server that drives most of that experience. And that thing is incredibly extensible, and so we can build prototypes really quickly with that. But nothing to my knowledge is there's like something that's off the shelf that's really easy to play with. The tools though that if you're just trying to sort of get, hey, I have agnostic of the UI. Hey, I have a bunch of ideas, some prompts, some insights, and some data, and I want to go pass that to a model, and then get the outputs and understand if I have a real product here, if I have an experience that I could add to my product. A lot of the tools that the model providers directly, whether it's OpenAI or Anthropic provide, or via the hyperscalers, are really great. The Vertex Model Garden, we spent a ton of time with in GCP. I know Amazon has similar capabilities. And so some of that actually lets you, in a very even more crude than what I showed way, to prototype products without a ton of energy and effort in sort of building custom things.
Great. And then two more questions for today. So the first one we're going to do is, how do you see the role of UX designers evolving in the product development process of AI products, particularly when the experience is sometimes indeterministic?
Yeah, totally. This is something our UX VP, I would love if she was here and she'd give you a great answer, but we've talked about this a lot. I think it's a mistake to assume that the entirety of the product experience with AI is locked into the indeterministic chat window. That was sort of the early thinking, and I'd even say that we maybe didn't think about it more deeply or deeply enough in the experience that surrounds the product and sorry, the features and the AI capabilities that you're building. And so a product designer needs to spend, they're your discovery partner. I harped on discovery. Like they're the person that should come alongside you in that journey. They're the ones that can help coordinate and decide what makes the most sense to do from a user experience perspective. And they have to think holistically about the experience and how it affects a workflow. I've used the term workflow a lot, and that might be somewhat unique to GitLab, but I would say it applies to most AI products I've seen. And the best people, in my opinion, that can think holistically about a workflow end to end as a UX designer. It makes their job harder because they can't solve for, like I talked about, golden path or happy path versus edge case, right? They can't solve for just the happy path. They have to solve in a way where there's like an amorphous box that can get filled in. And then based on the experience does something based on the output of that amorphous box, right? And so it makes their job more challenging, but it's almost more critical to have them plugged in. I would say it's almost like if you had one UX designer working on a problem before, you now need two, kind of thing, because you're having to have so much energy put into not only just the output of the experience, but everything that is affected along the way. And you really have to get deep quickly. And so that's sort of super high level, but that's how I see it happening.
Great. And then for our last question today, have you seen any real examples where AI is not the right strategy? Have you seen any surprising AI solutions that have really worked?
Interesting. So I'll give you a GitLab example. We had, like many companies, went through this wave of let's sprinkle AI over everything and see what works. And I think that's a great way to iterate and experiment, to be clear. But we learned some things along the way. And one of those was, hey, let's see if AI can be really good at predicting the outcome of one of those value stream analytics charts that I talked about, measuring developer efficiency. So could we have it predict deployment frequency and understand, hey, what's the rate of deployment? How might the rate of deployment change for a given customer, user, organization based on past performance? That's not how those AI models aren't going to necessarily do that better than simply a linear regression applied to the historical data, which is a heck of a lot cheaper, more accurate, and easier to deploy. And so you have to be careful not to just sprinkle AI over everything, because we've seen a lot of those examples. Not everything needs a chatbot as well. I think we're going to get chatbot fatigue. And so be careful. Make sure your chatbot is actually adding unique value, because as a user, you're not going to remember which chatbot you had the last interaction with that got you the result you needed, right? And then things that surprised me, I can't think of anything novel that you all might not have seen. Um, I think some of the the really interesting use cases around like image generation is really cool. It was surprising to me at the time because I hadn't fully understood the impact and power. Now it's old news. Adobe's, Photoshop stuff has been in market for about a year now. So I think that some of those are coming to mind. I'm intrigued by what Apple announced a couple weeks ago, and how they're taking that personal context and applying it to their product. I think we're gonna see a lot more of that going forward, where it's not just about these foundation models, but it's more tuned use cases that are a lot more narrow, and products that are a lot more narrow than just taking the largest LLM and shoving that on top of your product and seeing what happens.